In today's episode, we're looking at 6 disturbing deaths of normal people. From a man cooking an anniversary dinner in his kitchen with oil spilling on the floor, to a woman on her daily commute, wearing something meant for comfort, turns dangerous in the most unexpected way. It was July 28, 2018, at a community recreation center in Fort Collins, Colorado, when 43-year-old Tom Hendricks arrived for his usual morning swim before the facility opened to the public. Tom had worked as a swimming instructor at the center for 15 years and held certifications in lifeguarding, water safety, and CPR instruction. The recreation center pool was an indoor pool that measured 25 yards in length and had 6 lanes. The depth ranged from 3.5 feet at the shallow end to 12 feet at the diving area. The water temperature was kept at 82 degrees all year, and the pool used standard filtration and chemical systems that were checked daily by maintenance staff. Tom had taught hundreds of children how to swim in this pool, and was known as one of the most experienced instructors in the county. As an employee, Tom had key access to the building and permission to use the pool before opening hours, as long as he signed the early access log and followed safety rules. One of these rules required a second person to be present during swimming, but this rule was not always enforced for staff members. Experienced instructors like Tom were often allowed to swim alone in the mornings for personal fitness. Tom entered the building at 6:40 and signed in at the front desk. He changed in the men's locker room and entered the pool area at 6:48. The area was empty, the overhead lights were on, and the water surface was calm except for gentle movement from the filtration system. He did a short stretching routine on the pool deck before entering the water at the shallow end. His normal routine involved swimming non-stop laps for 30 to 40 minutes, switching between freestyle and backstroke. During the first 15 minutes, he completed about 12 laps, swimming at a steady pace with regular breathing that could be seen on the footage. At about 7:05, Tom stopped swimming and stood in the shallow section of lane 3, where the water depth was 4 feet 2 inches. He appeared to be resting between sets, leaning forward with his hands on his knees. Then the cramp came without warning. It was a sudden tightening of the calf muscle that caused severe pain and immediate loss of control in his lower leg. His posture changed instantly from stable standing to unsteady bending. He tried to lift the cramped leg to ease the pain while also trying to stay balanced. But the pain, surprise, and awkward position caused him to lose his balance. He fell sideways into the water, striking his head against the pool floor as he went under, even though the depth was shallow enough that he would normally have been able to stand with his head above the surface. The impact left him briefly disoriented. During an involuntary gasp, water entered his airway, and despite the shallow depth, he was unable to regain stable footing or effective control of his movements. The facility manager arrived at 7:25 to prepare for opening and entered the pool area at 7:30. She noticed Tom's towel and water bottle on the deck, but did not see him in the pool right away. As she walked along the pool edge checking equipment readings, she spotted his body underwater in lane 3. She immediately activated the emergency alarm, entered the water, pulled him onto the deck, and began CPR while calling emergency services. Paramedics arrived within 7 minutes and continued resuscitation efforts, but Tom showed no signs of life. He was transported to a medical center, where he was pronounced dead. The official cause of death was drowning following submersion in the pool. The recreation center remained closed for the rest of the day, as staff notified authorities and documented the incident. Early access swimming policies were later reviewed, including enforcement of the requirement that no one swim alone before opening hours. It was April 15, 2018, in a quiet residential neighborhood in Boise, Idaho. 34-year-old Melissa Tran was taking her golden retriever, Cooper, out for their usual evening walk. Melissa worked as a marketing coordinator for a regional outdoor equipment company, a desk-based job that kept her sedentary during the day, and her nightly walks had become a routine way to stay active. She had adopted Cooper from a rescue group in 2017, and the walks were a regular part of their daily schedule. The neighborhood consisted of single-family homes built in the early 2000s, with sidewalks, mature trees, and grassy strips maintained by a homeowners association. Melissa's typical route covered about 1.5 miles, looping through nearby streets and greenbelt paths. Traffic was light, and the area was familiar and uneventful. Cooper was a 3-year-old, 78-pound neutered male who usually walked well on a leash. Melissa used a standard 6-foot nylon leash clipped to his collar, equipment she had used many times without issue. As they walked along a residential street, Cooper moved slightly ahead on her left, sniffing the grass, while Melissa held her phone in her right hand and the leash in her left. Suddenly, a gray squirrel came out from behind a parked car about 30 feet ahead of them. It ran quickly across the grass toward a tree near the sidewalk. Cooper saw the squirrel right away and reacted as many retrievers do. He lunged forward with sudden strength. Melissa had seen this behavior before when Cooper noticed squirrels or rabbits, and she usually handled it by steadying herself and giving a firm verbal command. This time, the squirrel changed direction without warning and ran back toward Cooper instead of away from him. Cooper's reaction became stronger. He pulled hard to the left while also jumping forward. The leash was already tight from the first pull, and as Cooper moved in a curved path, the leash wrapped around Melissa's left ankle. As Cooper continued forward, the leash tightened around her lower leg. Melissa's forward movement stopped suddenly because her ankle was held by the leash, but the rest of her body kept moving. She tried to regain her balance by stepping forward with her right foot, but the pull from the leash had already thrown her off balance. She fell backward. Her arms moved automatically as she tried to protect herself, but she was unable to stop her head from hitting the ground. The grassy strip beside the sidewalk appeared level and well-maintained, covered in thick turf managed by the homeowners association. Hidden beneath the grass, however, was a concrete parking block buried in the soil. It had been installed years earlier to prevent cars from encroaching onto the lawn, and was never removed after nearby driveways were modified. When Melissa fell backward, the back of her head struck the exposed edge of the concrete block. The concentrated impact delivered her full body weight onto a hard surface, causing severe skull fractures and traumatic brain injury that immediately rendered her unconscious. She lay motionless in the grass with her phone nearby and the leash slack beside her. Cooper stood close, distracted moments earlier by the squirrel. A neighbor collecting mail nearby witnessed the fall and ran over, finding Melissa unresponsive with visible head trauma. Emergency services were called immediately. Paramedics arrived within 9 minutes and transported Melissa to a medical center, where she underwent emergency surgery for critical head injuries. Despite intervention, extensive brain damage left no chance of recovery. After 48 hours with no signs of brain activity, life support was withdrawn. A routine evening walk ended when a hidden hazard, a sudden pull, and a single misstep aligned in seconds. It was January 11th, 2017, during the morning rush at a metro station in Washington, D.C. 29-year-old Diane Foster was boarding her usual train on the Red Line as part of her daily commute. She worked as a paralegal at a downtown law firm and had followed the same routine almost every weekday for years. Same station, same car, same time. The platform was crowded that morning. Minor delays along the line had compressed the schedule, and commuters stood shoulder to shoulder near the doors. Diane typically boarded at Glenmont around 7:45 a.m. and preferred the center doors of the third car, where standing space made it easier to exit later. She wore office clothes beneath a heavy wool coat to protect against the freezing temperature outside. Around her neck was a long knitted scarf, dark red and nearly 6 feet in length. It was made from thick yarn and worn loosely, with both ends hanging down the front of her coat. Diane had received it as a gift from her sister weeks earlier and had worn it often during winter commutes without incident. When the train arrived, passengers exited, while others moved forward to board. Diane stepped toward the open doorway with several people at once. The space was tight, and as she crossed the threshold, a commuter behind her accidentally bumped her shoulder, causing her to shift slightly sideways as she entered the car. As Diane stepped fully inside, One loose end of her scarf brushed against the narrow edge seam of the closing doors. When the doors shut, a portion of the fabric became pinched at the seam, thin enough that it did not trigger the pressure sensors designed to detect solid obstructions. The doors closed completely, trapping part of the scarf outside the train while the rest remained wrapped around Diane's neck. There was a brief pause before the train began to move. During that moment, Diane felt the scarf pull tight and instinctively raised her hands to unwrap it. Under normal circumstances, she could have removed it easily. But as the train accelerated out of the station, the tension increased rapidly. She was pulled backward toward the doors. The force tightened the scarf against her neck before she could loosen it. Her breathing became restricted, and she struggled to stay upright as nearby passengers turned toward her, initially unsure what was happening. Within seconds, one passenger realized the scarf was caught and activated the passenger emergency handle. Because the train had only just begun moving and had not fully cleared the platform, braking was initiated almost immediately. The train began to slow, but it continued moving forward several more seconds before coming to a stop. During those seconds, Diane was pressed against the doors as the scarf tightened further. She could not call out, and her movements weakened quickly. Several passengers tried to support Diane and pull at the scarf to relieve pressure, but the crowded car limited movement. By the time the train came to a full stop, she had lost consciousness. After emergency protocols were initiated, the operator manually released the doors, freeing the trapped scarf and allowing passengers to pull her to the floor. Paramedics arrived and took over resuscitation efforts, but Diane had no pulse and showed signs of severe oxygen deprivation. She was transported to a hospital where doctors determined the prolonged lack of oxygen had caused catastrophic brain damage. She was pronounced dead later that morning. The train was removed from service while officials reviewed the incident under standard safety procedures. A routine commute ended when a loose scarf, a crowded platform, and a few seconds of movement combined into a fatal chain no one anticipated. It was October 14th, 2018, and 71-year-old Margaret Patterson was volunteering at the public library in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. She was working her usual Saturday afternoon shift. Margaret was a retired administrative assistant who, after leaving full-time work, found herself struggling with boredom and too much unstructured time. To stay active and feel useful, she decided to volunteer at the local library. The library was a small public branch serving a local neighborhood, and on weekends it operated with very few staff members on duty. Margaret had been volunteering at the library for 9 years. Every Saturday she worked for about 3 hours. Her job was to organize returned books and put them back on the shelves, mainly in the nonfiction section. The library had rolling ladders attached to several tall bookshelf units. These ladders were used to reach books stored up to 7 feet above the floor. They were commercial ladders installed when the building was first constructed. Each ladder had rubber wheels, a handrail, and a locking system designed to stop the ladder from moving while in use. Margaret had used these ladders hundreds of times before, without any problems, and library staff believed the ladders were safe and well maintained. On this day, the ladder Margaret chose looked normal and appeared to be working properly. She positioned it beside the nonfiction shelves in the 900 section and believed she had locked the wheels. She then climbed 4 steps up the ladder to reach the upper shelf. Unknown to Margaret, the right side wheel bracket of the ladder had developed a very small crack at the welded joint where it connected to the ladder frame. This crack was not visible during normal inspection. It had likely formed and slowly worsened over several months of regular use. The metal had become weak due to fatigue, but the damage remained hidden under layers of paint and dust. As Margaret reached out to place a book on the shelf, she shifted her weight slightly to the right. At that moment, the weakened bracket suddenly broke. The wheel assembly separated from the ladder frame, causing the ladder to lose support on one side. The ladder tilted sharply. Margaret tried to grab the handrail, but the ladder had already tipped too far to recover. Sometime in the mid-afternoon, she fell about 5 feet and hit the floor on her left side. The fall fractured her hip and her head struck the tile floor. She remained conscious but was confused and disoriented. She was unable to stand up or effectively call for help. At around 4:30 p.m., another volunteer arrived for the closing shift. She noticed that Margaret's purse was still at the workstation and went to look for her. She found Margaret lying on the floor, unresponsive, with the ladder lying on its side nearby. Emergency services were called immediately. Margaret was taken to the hospital, but she was pronounced dead about 2 hours later. The official cause of death was a traumatic brain injury, compounded by internal bleeding from the hip fracture and shock following the fall. What should have been another quiet afternoon of putting books back in order ended with a hidden crack, a broken ladder, and a volunteer who never made it home. It was February 9th, 2017, in a kitchen in suburban Portland, Oregon. 36-year-old David Kowalski was cooking dinner to celebrate his 8th wedding anniversary. David worked as an IT support technician for a mid-sized logistics company, a routine office job that involved troubleshooting computer problems and maintaining internal systems. He had left work early that afternoon so he could surprise his wife by preparing her favorite meal: carbonara made with homemade pasta. David was a skilled home cook who enjoyed challenging recipes and often spent weekends trying new techniques. The kitchen was well equipped and had been remodeled 2 years earlier. It had quartz countertops, professional-style appliances, and polished concrete floors. The concrete floor was chosen because it was durable and looked modern. His wife, Jennifer, was expected home at 7:30 p.m., which gave him enough time to finish cooking. David started by gathering his ingredients. He filled a large pot with water, added salt, and placed it on the gas stove to boil. The recipe required careful timing. The pasta needed to be cooked right before serving, and the sauce had to be made slowly so the eggs would not cook too fast. While getting olive oil from the pantry, David poured too much and spilled about 2 tablespoons onto the concrete floor near the stove. He saw the spill but decided to clean it later. At the moment, he was handling several steps at once, and the water was almost boiling. He turned back toward the counter holding a package of pancetta. After taking 3 steps, his right foot landed directly on the oil. The polished concrete floor was very slippery. His foot slid forward. He lost his balance and he fell backward with full force. As he fell, the back of his head hit the sharp edge of the quartz countertop. The angle of the fall caused severe injury to his head and neck. David immediately lost consciousness and collapsed onto the floor. Blood began to collect beneath his head from the impact. At the same time, the pot of water continued to boil, and steam rose from the stove. A kitchen timer continued counting down. Jennifer arrived home at 7:28 p.m., 2 minutes earlier than expected. She entered through the garage and walked into the kitchen. She saw David lying on the floor, the pot boiling over, and smelled pancetta burning in the pan. She called emergency services right away and tried to check on him, but he was not breathing and had no pulse. Paramedics arrived about 8 minutes later and tried to revive him, but it was unsuccessful. David was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner later confirmed that the fall caused a severe skull fracture and fatal injury to the brainstem. Death occurred within seconds, and even immediate help would not have changed the outcome. The dinner meant to mark 8 years of marriage was never served, undone by a moment most cooks would ignore, and a fall that left no second chance. It was November 3rd, 2019, at a regional foods grocery store in Tucson, Arizona. 28-year-old Marcus Sweeney was working the evening shift in the stock department. The store was open 24 hours a day and employed 18 workers across 3 shifts. Evening shifts usually had fewer employees to reduce labor costs. Marcus had worked at the store for 4 years and knew all the storage areas well, including the walk-in freezer located at the back of the warehouse. The walk-in freezer was a commercial unit measuring 12 feet by 16 feet. It was kept at -2 degrees Fahrenheit. The freezer stored extra frozen items, seasonal products, and bulk goods that did not fit in the customer freezer cases. At about 8:45 p.m., The night manager asked Marcus to retrieve 3 cases of frozen vegetables so the display freezers could be restocked before late-night shoppers arrived. The vegetables were stored on the back shelf of the freezer, which required Marcus to walk fully inside and move past stacked pallets of other frozen products. Marcus entered the freezer without telling anyone exactly where he was going. This was normal practice for routine stock work. The freezer door was a heavy, insulated door designed to seal tightly. It had an outside handle and an inside emergency release handle. Store policy required the door to remain unlocked during business hours, allowing workers to exit using the internal handle. The internal release handle had been malfunctioning for about 3 weeks. The glow-in-the-dark grip, meant to remain visible in low light, had become obscured by ice buildup and wear, and the latch often stuck unless significant force was applied. 2 employees had already reported the problem, and a maintenance request had been submitted. The repair was scheduled for the following week and was considered non-urgent because the handle still worked occasionally, and the freezer was not seen as a high-risk area. Marcus found the frozen vegetable cases and placed them on a handcart near the door. When he tried to leave, he pushed the internal handle, but it did not respond. He pushed harder, but the latch did not release. The handle had frozen in place due to moisture inside the latch mechanism. As his hands numbed and his vision blurred in the cold, the release handle was difficult to see and failed to move when he pulled on it. This problem was made worse by the extreme temperature difference between the freezer and the warehouse. Marcus banged on the door and shouted for help. However, the freezer was heavily insulated to keep cold air inside, and the constant hum of the evaporator fans inside the unit further drowned out any sound coming from within. At that time, the warehouse area was empty, and other employees were working in different parts of the store. Marcus was wearing normal work clothes, a polo shirt and khaki pants. He was not wearing protective cold weather gear because freezer trips usually lasted only a few minutes. As his body was exposed to extreme cold, his blood vessels narrowed, and he began shivering. Within about 15 minutes, his hands and legs started losing strength and coordination as his body temperature dropped. The night manager believed Marcus had completed the task and continued with other duties, but Marcus remained trapped inside as his condition steadily worsened. As prolonged cold exposure set in, his strength faded, his coordination failed, and he eventually lost consciousness. The closing shift arrived at 11 p.m. When Marcus did not respond to radio calls, his absence was noticed. A search began at 11:20 p.m. At 11:32 p.m., a stock worker opened the walk-in freezer and found Marcus lying on the floor, unresponsive, with frost visible on his clothing and exposed skin. Emergency services were called immediately. Marcus was transported to the hospital, where he was pronounced dead 30 minutes later from complications of severe hypothermia, including cardiac arrest brought on by prolonged cold exposure. A work shift ended when a locked freezer and a lack of checks left one employee trapped and unnoticed for hours. Thanks for watching. Enjoy this video? Click more.